Okay, welcome to part two of the video final. We're looking at about a 2 hour total here. I'm hoping to get under it. Okay, so let's get started as soon as we can. So we just left off. We talked about what can cause a recession, right? That's a decrease in C plus I plus G plus NX. Anything that causes a decrease in aggregate demand. All right, we talked about expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. So here we're going to go into those policies a little bit more. And one of the things we mentioned was an automatic stabilizer. Okay, and an automatic stabilizer is federal expenditures and tax revenues that automatically change levels in order to stabilize an economic expansion or contraction. So these are, if you believe what I've just told you, okay, or what the book just told you, because I don't believe it, but if you believe that that spending generates real output, okay, and that an economy goes into a recession when there's a decrease in spending, or it goes into a boom or a inflationary price inflationary situation when you have an increase in aggregate demand, okay, spending, that you need to offset those spendings. And an automatic stabilizer is something that works counter to the change in aggregate demand automatically. Okay, so if spending decreases, then federal tax expenditures may, federal expenditures may increase or move in the opposite direction. Okay, now examples of automatic stabilizers are transfer payments. These are things like Social Security, okay, where we take money out of one person's pocket, the government takes it and then gives it and puts it in another person's pocket. Nothing is produced in exchange for those payments. Those are called transfer payments. Social Security, welfare, we commonly call welfare, okay? There's welfare. Unemployment compensation, okay? If the economy, if output in the economy decreases and we go into a recession, more people get laid off, and the government spending increases because they're paying those people unemployment compensation, and they may drop below the poverty level, so we start paying them welfare. Okay, and then tax collections move in the opposite direction. Okay, so if incomes go down, then um, people's incomes go down, they move into lower tax brackets. So that would reduce taxes when the economy goes into a recession. Remember, he said lowering taxes is an example of an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. On the other hand, if the economy's overheated in a boom, people's incomes are going to go up, and then they'll creep into higher tax brackets, and taxes will increase to cool off spending. Those are examples of um, automatic stabilizers. So here's an example. You get an increase in real GDP. Tax collections rise, incomes go up, people pay more in taxes, and government transfer payments fall. So we get an increase in taxes and we get a decrease in government transfer payments. Those are both contractionary fiscal policy to counter this increase in real GDP. And you get a budget surplus, which offsets inflation, theoretically, if we ever head close to a balanced budget, or maybe even a budget to begin with here in the US. Go ahead and answer these questions, and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. What is a budget surplus? A budget surplus is a budget in which government revenues exceed government expenditures in a given time period. So the government takes in more money in taxes than they pay out in expenditures. This has not really ever happened in the US since 1955, but we could always have hope. But theoretically, during a boom, the government should, according to these economists, this thinking, engage in a budget surplus where they take in more in taxes than they send out in expenditures. Okay, Now here, what if the economy is in a recession, right? We get a decrease in real GDP. Things are going poorly. Okay, tax collections would fall because people's incomes would go down as people got laid off and worked less hours. Tax collections would fall. Lowering tax collections is a expansionary fiscal policy, and government transfer payments rise. So government spending would increase, taxes go down. Those are both expansionary policies when we're talking about these automatic stabilizers. And as a result, that would help to cause a budget deficit, okay, which would offset the recession because of expansionary fiscal policy boosting aggregate demand. A budget deficit occurs is a, or excuse me, is a budget deficit is a budget in which government expenditures exceed government revenues in a given time period. Okay, so if this set of automatic stabilizers were set right, we have no idea how to do that. Okay, when we're at full employment here at $14 trillion, let's say, a year, and these are old numbers, government expenditures would exactly match, that's the G, tax revenues. Okay, right there in the middle. If, say, the economy went into a recession, real GDP dropped, say to 12 million, taxes would decrease because people are making less income, paying less in taxes, but at the same time, government expenditures would go up, and this would incur a budget deficit. Government spending is above taxes. That's a budget deficit. Increase government spending, lower taxes. Those are expansionary monetary policy that should boost aggregate demand. And as the economy works back towards full employment, this budget deficit would disappear. On the other hand, let's say the economy gets too overheated. So we're operating out here at $16 trillion worth of GDP. You can see here that as the incomes people make go up, transfer payments go down. So the government now is spending less money. That is contractionary fiscal policy. At the same time, as people's incomes go up, the amount of taxes they pay increases. That is also contractionary fiscal policy. So that would cause a budget surplus. The government is taking more in taxes than they're sending back out in spending, and that would drive the economy back towards full employment GDP if these things could or are set up right, which they aren't, and we don't know how to do it. And you see the budget surplus when the economy is overheated, and the budget deficit when the economy is in a recession. Okay, expansionary fiscal policy takes place here. Contractionary fiscal policy takes place when we're in the green region. Okay, go ahead and answer these short questions and come right back, and we will get going. Welcome back. Here we're going to look at something called supply side fiscal policy. The supply side economists are more orientated towards what we call the classical economists. Okay, and they think that decreases in output are not what we would call transitory or temporary, that they're all permanent changes. And you can think of this as though that aggregate supply curve is increasing or decreasing every time real GDP goes up or down. Okay, so they think that prices and wages adjust. Okay, that's why they're the vertical long run aggregate supply curve, and that output changes are related to supply side factors. Okay, so they emphasize a fiscal policy that emphasizes government policies that increase aggregate supply rather than aggregate demand. There's two sides of the coin. They advocate the other side from what the Keynesians and their fiscal policy recommend. So the purpose of supply-side fiscal policies is to achieve long-run growth in real output, full employment, and to decrease price levels over time. So an increase in government spending and a decrease in net taxes, those are demand side factors that the Keynesians recommended, okay? And they would bump out this aggregate demand curve. So here, right, we get the economy's in a recession. Here's full employment. We're operating below it. To get back to full employment, you boost demand. So the government decides to build a roads project, right? And they're going to spend so much money on roads, and that's going to increase aggregate demand and bring the economy back out towards full employment. Okay? And prices are going to go up. Now, the supply siders say no. We need to focus on supply side factors. Not only will this get the economy out of a rut or increase real output in the economy, but over the long haul, it'll produce real economic growth, not some Keynesian demand side trick, and decrease prices over time. And remember, we talked about those people who are hurt by rising prices. Examples would be retired people, orphans, okay, people on fixed incomes. So here, if we can decrease resource prices, promote technological advances, subsidize firms, and decrease regulations, that's going to cause an increase in the aggregate supply curve. Okay, and that will get us back towards what we consider to be full employment. So here the economy is in a recession, right? We're producing below full employment. Instead of increasing aggregate demand, which is going to cause prices to go up at the same time to get back towards $12 trillion worth of full employment, instead of doing that, if we can increase aggregate supply, then we can get back to full employment and have lower prices. And we can do this by reducing resource prices, say allowing oil fields that were previously untapped to be tapped to lower the price of oil, or decreasing interest rates, or decreasing government regulations. Those things can all increase this aggregate supply curve, right, and bring us back towards this $12 trillion full employment level. And this isn't a trick, right? If they do this correctly, these are long-term changes that aren't going to go away until something else comes along and throws the economy off kilter. Okay, so one thing we can do is supply side policies affect labor markets. So here, before a tax cut, here's the labor supply curve, here's wages, here's the amount of labor working in the economy, right? If we cut taxes, that gives people more of an incentive to work. More people will supply more labor at any given price. And you can see here, we'll increase the amount of labor, which will increase the amount of output produced in the economy after a tax cut. These policies were very popular at the beginning of the Reagan administration. There were a lot of supply siders on Ronald Reagan's team. Okay. You can see we increase the amount of labor being put to use in the labor force. That decreases wages. We produce more output. And if we produce more output without increasing aggregate demand, that is going to cause price levels to fall. So even though people are getting lower wages, they're still able to buy more goods and services with those wages, because at the same time, we're producing more goods and services as their wages are going down. Now, What is the difference between government spending, G, which the Keynesians use mostly, and government expenditures, which we talked about when we talked about the budget? Government spending does not include transfer payments, but government expenditures or outlays does. Okay? Transfer payments don't count towards GDP because money's just being taken out of one pocket and put into another. So when we look at government spending, that does not include those transfer payments, but government expenditures do. So when we talk about balancing a budget, we've got to balance the expenditures, not government spending, with taxes. Okay. If we look at the size and growth of government expenditures since 1929, which also happens to correspond to the Great Depression and the movement towards a belief that business cycles are inherent in capitalism and that governments need to manage the economy, you can see here that total government expenditures have grown from 10% of US GDP to about 34% of US GDP. So from 1/10 to basically 1/3 of all spending in the economy is now government spending. And here is the growth of government expenditures as a percentage of GDP. You can see here there's 29, right? There's the World War, right? The government expenditures have typically remained constant, and that's federal government expenditures, okay? And, oh, I'm sorry, in the blue, my fault, I was highlighting the red. Federal government expenditures are in the red. Total government expenditures are in the blue. That includes state and local government expenditures. So if you look, we're really seeing almost over 45%, and that's gone up since this chart ended in 2014. We're looking at government expenditures of probably half of the economy. Okay, what is the dominant trend in federal government spending between 1970 and today? Since 1970, and this corresponds with roughly with the Great Society and increase in welfare benefits or transfer payments in the US, we have a category called income security that includes transfer payments and has become about 1/2 of all government expenditures. So almost one out of every $2 or 50 cents out of every dollar that the federal government spends is on these transfer payments. And you might say, well, what does that look like, right? Here we have 1970, and then we have 2014. You can see in 1970, the largest component of US spending was national defense, and that was to maintain the US empire, right? And income security, which includes these transfer payments, was only 22%. And this is right about the time of the Great Society. These social programs have become so big that they now consume, in 2014, over half of all US government expenditures. National defense is here at 17. Education and health has gone from 11 to 13, so it's gone up a little bit. But look at things like this. Net interest on the debt, 9%. Now that's 7. Veterans benefits, 4% from 5. Others gone down to 2 from 3. International affairs, 1%. Okay, that's going to cut in half. And agricultural spending has gone from 3% to 1%. So you can see that this big pink area here is income security, Social Security, a transfer payment. What we commonly call welfare, aid to families with dependents, unemployment compensation, Medicare, Medicaid. These things are all consuming more of the budget. In fact, it's more than doubled since 1970. Okay. In the US, our expenditures typically consist of a lower percentage of GDP than other industrialized countries. So if you look, here's the United States, and as we move to the left, you can see that these more socialized countries spend higher and higher portions of their um, of their GDP as government expenditures, and this is from 2014. We'll take a quick test and then come back. Welcome back. So we looked at the expenditure side. Most of our money goes out for these social security or these social welfare payments. Where does the money that the federal government gets come from? And a lot of people say, oh, we got to go tax rich corporations. We'll see how much of the government's income actually comes from corporations. And then, of course, you have to remember that corporations are just pieces of paper, that they are really owned by real people. And they're not all wealthy people. Okay, if you have a pension or if you have a 401k, you own parts of corporations. And if we increase corporate taxes, the corporation doesn't pay taxes. It's a piece of paper. It's really the shareholders who pay those taxes. And they aren't all rich. Okay, so what are the largest sources of federal government revenue? They are actually income taxes, and the second largest is social insurance taxes. You can see here, individual income taxes comprised about 46% of all government receipts in the year 2014. Then next to it are social insurance taxes. These are things like your Social Security tax, Medicare, Medicaid. Okay, these are all things that are taken out of your paycheck and or matched or paid by your employers. Then we have 3% excise taxes. These are taxes placed directly on a good like gasoline, alcohols, tobacco. 11% of the federal government's income comes from corporate income taxes and 6% from other sources. How do taxes in the U.S. compare to taxes in other countries? Typically, U.S. citizens are among the most lightly taxed people in the industrialized world. Here we look at 2014. There's the U.S., 34%. Japan and Australia, fairly close. We get to places like Denmark and France, where over half of people's incomes are taxed away by the government. Okay. What is the size and growth of total government taxes? Since 1929, total government taxes have grown from 11% of GDP to about 30% of GDP. So this is total government taxes. This is federal, state, and local here in the blue. And look at the expansion of those taxes. Okay, they've grown. Federal income taxes are here in the red. If you tax people more, they're going to work less. Okay, if you tax something, you're penalizing it. If you subsidize something, you're rewarding it. So in essence, with our taxes going up and the bulk of them being taxes on income, that penalizes people for making incomes. If we go back to the expenditure side of things, the growth of social welfare programs, which pay people not to work, either directly or indirectly, and to not make incomes, have gone up. So we're penalizing people for being productive and earning incomes, while at the same time, we're subsidizing people who either don't, can't, or won't be productive and earn incomes. And as a result of that, taxes and government expenditures have to go up to pay for these social programs. We'll give you a few seconds to answer, and then we will go on. So answer your questions. All right. So we've talked about taxes and expenditures for the government. What policies determine how taxes are paid? And there are basically two different views on this. There's the benefits received principle and the ability to pay. Okay, these are two attempts to justify taxation. They say, well, you've received benefits that you should pay for. So the more you receive, the more you should pay, or you can pay more than the other guy, so you should pay more. The benefits received principle, as I said, says those who benefit from government expenditures should pay the taxes that finance their benefits. Okay? So the more government services you use, the more roads you drive on, the more parks you visit, the more you should pay. People who do not benefit from the government should not pay. The other principle is the ability to pay. And it says that those who have higher incomes can afford to pay a greater proportion of their income in taxes, regardless of the benefits. And if you look, the income tax is the largest component of U.S. government receipts or revenues, the taxes. As a result of that, those taxes are what we call progressive. The more you make, the higher the percentage of your income you pay. So if we were to say which principle dominates in the US, it is the ability to pay, because most taxes are paid through income taxes and social program taxes, but the income taxes are the most, and those are based on the ability to pay. The more you make, the higher the percentage of your income that you should pay in taxes theoretically. And that is because we have a progressive income tax. And that is a tax that charges a higher percentage of income as incomes rise. So if your income goes up and you pay a higher percentage of that income in taxes, that's a progressive tax, and that defines our income tax system. Another way of doing the taxes would be an average tax rate. There, you take the total tax due divided by the total taxable income, okay? And everybody pays an average tax rate. Okay, I'm sorry. They don't pay that. That's how you calculate your average tax rate. So you take the total tax due. So let's say you owe $1,000 in taxes for the year. You divide that by your income. Say you made $10,000. Your average tax rate would be 10%. 1,000 divided by 10,000. That's 10%. Okay, 1/10. Another thing we have to look at in taxes is the marginal tax rate. And that is the change in taxes due divided by the change in taxable income. When we look at a progressive tax system, as your income goes up, the marginal tax rate increases. So everybody pays 5% on income up to 10,000. If you make more than 10,000, that 10,000 in first dollar up to 100,000 might be taxed at 20%. So if you were to go from 10,000 to $10,001 or anything in that bracket, your marginal tax rate, the amount of taxes paid, change in your taxes due divided by the change in your income as it goes up, would be that 20%. Okay. There's also something called a regressive tax, and that is a tax that charges a lower percentage of incomes as your income rises. Okay. An example of a regressive tax might be, let's say, Social Security taxes above a certain point. If you are being charged, if you're working and you're charged for Social Security taxes, there's a cap. And if you make more than that amount of income, that income isn't taxed for Social Security. You paid enough in. So, because you're not going to receive it, is what they kind of think. So, there's a limit, there's a cap on it. If you make more than that cap, the tax becomes regressive. You earn more money, but you don't pay any more in the tax. That would be an example of a regressive tax. A proportional tax is a tax that charges the same percentage of your income regardless of the size of your income. And that is also called a flat tax. Many conservative or quasi-conservative people advocated proportional tax. They say, let's get rid of all tax deductions and all this other stuff, and let's get rid of the progressive tax system, and let's just have people pay a flat tax. And that flat tax might be 20% of your income. So no matter if you make $1, $100, $10,000, $100,000, or $1 billion, you just pay a flat 20% tax out of that income. So the guy who makes $1 would pay 20 cents in taxes. The guy who makes $1 billion would pay, I believe, $200 million in taxes. But it would be the same percentage of your income no matter how much you made. And that's a proportional tax. Okay, here's what tax schedules actually looked like. These are from 2014. And you can see I was kind of close. From $0 to $9,075 in income, you pay a 10% tax rate. As your income goes up, every dollar you make over $9,075, but not over $36,900, gets taxed at a different marginal tax rate. It's 15%. If you make more than every dollar you make over $36,900, but not over $89,350, the tax rate on those dollars goes to 25%. The next group you can see here, 28%, and then the top groups, or not the top group, but the next to top group, it goes to 33%. And if you make over $405,100, all of that income gets taxed at a 39.6% rate. Okay. So if you were, say, making $405,100, right? And then you earned one more dollar, that $1 falls in this tax bracket, not this one, and it gets taxed at 39.6% rather than the old 33.0%. Okay. Everything up to this, it tells you where they get taxed. Anything over that, you're getting in this, those dollars fall in this new bracket. Now, progressive income tax versus a flat tax. Here, they say that if roughly, and it depends on whose estimates you look at, but the flat tax experts, or proponents say, oh, instead of going through all these tax brackets and progressive income tax, if we just had a 17% flat tax rate, that would be revenue neutral. Okay. And it would reward people who are highly productive and make higher incomes because their tax rates would go down. Okay. And penalize these less productive, lower income people because their tax rates would go up a little bit. Okay. But it doesn't penalize you from jumping brackets. Let's say you were making $15,000 here roughly, and you're paying $15,000. Then you get a pay raise. Well, that's great, except that new income gets taxed at a higher rate. A lot of people will say, I don't want a pay raise, I don't want to get promoted because I don't want my taxes to go up. Okay, at 17%, no matter what happens to your income, your tax rate doesn't change, so we don't have these problems. Okay, here you're being penalized for making these extra dollars here. Okay, if you make over 36,900, that money gets taxed at a higher rate, and you're penalized. You're being penalized for being more productive. Here, your tax rate wouldn't change; it stay at 17 no matter what you made. Okay, go ahead and answer your questions, and we'll come back. All right. The next thing we're going to look at is something called public choice theory. We have to ask ourselves, okay, if you go back before public choice theory comes along, everybody just assumed that democracy worked, that the people we voted for had our interest at heart and acted based on the public will, right? They exercised the public will, and they didn't exercise their own will, which of course is naive. Okay, to think that we could elect politicians, right, people we've never met, that they could somehow know and would act in our interests is silly. It's ridiculous. It's a fairy tale. Okay? So public choice theory comes along and actually applies sort of economic analysis to government itself. And it's the analysis of the government decision-making process to allocate resources. Okay, do governments actually act in the will of their voters? Or if it's not a democracy, do dictatorships or kings or whatever we want to call them, do they act in accordance with the will of the people? And the answer is no. Okay. Why might governments be inefficient in solving society's problems? Of course, this is a nice way of saying they don't solve society's problems, or they're not good at it. Okay? Why would you think that Donald Trump or Joe Biden somehow cares about you? Right? I mean, he doesn't even know your name. If I went up and told Joe Biden your name, he'd say, "Who?" Right? Say, "Do they have any money? I need some campaign money for the next election." All right? Same thing with Trump, right? He doesn't know who you are. None of them do, right? So how could they rule in your interest when they don't even know you exist? Okay? Now, some of the issues that come about in public choice are, one, the majority rule problem. Why is it that simply because a majority of people vote for someone, why is it that we somehow assume that the right thing is being done? There's the special interest effect, the rational ignorance. This one is very interesting. Why is it that we assume that people vote for the right person? It's always, you were told in elementary school that democracy is the most wonderful thing in the world. The will of the people gets carried out because they vote for some guy and he gets to be in office. What makes us think that people know the right answers? Take this. Let's say your car was broken, okay? And you wanted to get it fixed. How should you do that? Should you take a vote? Should you go out and take a vote and maybe poll everybody in your neighborhood? Say, hey, when I put the ignition in the car and I turn the key in the ignition, it doesn't work. What's wrong with my car? What should I do? Right? Some people might say, oh, your tires are underinflated, or someone might say, oh, your catalytic converter is out. Or some people might say it's a computer problem, or it's an engine problem, or it's an electrical problem, or maybe your battery's dead. So we take a vote. Why would we assume that people will vote for the right cure for your car problem? They wouldn't, because most people don't know anything about cars. Mechanics do, engineers do, but janitors don't necessarily. Fashion designers don't. Why should their vote count just as much as anybody else's? So here's rational ignorance, and then bureaucratic inefficiency, and the short-sightedness effect. Okay, so these are all problems as to why governments aren't good at solving society's problems. Okay. One way of looking at government policies is a cost-benefit analysis. This was, again, big under the Reagan administration. And even today, this idea still permeates through some government decisions. Okay, and this is a comparison of the additional rewards with the cost of an economic alternative. So to give you an example of this, a firm will produce additional units as long as the marginal benefits exceeds the marginal cost. So I'll keep producing units of output as long as the additional revenues I make from producing it exceed the cost of producing that unit. at some point, if I produce one more unit, the cost of that additional unit will exceed the benefits and I will not produce it. So I'll stop before I get there. And this makes society better off because I've produced something that's worth more to my fellow man than the resources or the next best thing I could have produced with them. And I've created value, wealth, and made the world a better place on the free market. Governments have a problem with doing this. Okay. Here's an example. We've got voter Bob, Juan, and Teresa here. And we've got Park Project A and Park Project B. Okay. In the case of Park Project A, each person, or B, is going to get taxed $100 to pay for the park. Bob hates nature. He never goes to the park. Okay. So he says, if I vote for this, I'm going to pay $100. I'm going to get zero benefits from it. I'm not going to vote for the park. Juan and Teresa say, yeah, I would slightly benefit. My life's a little bit better off. I'd be willing to pay $101 for a park. I only have to pay $100 in taxes to get the park. So they vote yes. So the marginal cost of the park is $300, but the marginal benefit, how much these guys would actually be willing to pay for these things, is $202. Yet the vote passes. On the other hand, Park Project B here, Bob likes it, but he'd rather have the money, do something else with it, than have the park. He gets $90 in benefits from the park he'd have to pay $100 for. So he votes no. Juan has the same feeling. Okay, maybe this is a park with a lake, and Juan and Bob don't really care about water sports, right? So this one has playground equipment. Juan and Teresa have kids, and Bob doesn't. So here, Juan says, "Yeah, I don't know. It cost me $100. I only get about $90 in value from it. I'm not going to vote for it." So Juan and Bob vote no. Teresa here, who really benefits from it, maybe she likes to fish, right? Is a fishing fanatic, and this pond out there, she'd be able to go fish every other day, and she'd get $301 in benefits from it, and she only has to pay $100, so she votes yes. If we add up the marginal cost of the park, it's $300, just like this one. But the marginal benefit of Park B is $481. But the number of no votes exceeds the yes votes. So this better park, which would make everyone better off, fails, while this park, who just barely makes two people better off, but really just drives Bob crazy, passes. So here, marginal cost, marginal benefits aren't taken account into when people vote. The majority rule problem. Voting can lead to a rejection of projects with marginal total benefits exceeding the marginal cost. Can majority rule lead to inefficient solutions? Yes. One person, one vote cannot measure the intensity of voters' preferences as well as the market. Let's use a present example. Let's say that we want to take a vote. Should people be forced to get and pay for the COVID vaccine? There are a lot of people out there who are kind of like, well, yeah, I guess, yeah, a little bit, right? So those people are going to vote yes. Meanwhile, maybe the people who oppose that, they think it's the mark of the devil, or they think that the vaccine is untested and unsafe, and they absolutely, with every fiber of their soul, don't want to get vaccinated. The intensity of their feeling doesn't show up in the vote. So maybe more people say, I guess it's kind of good, I'll vote for it, than people who are just totally opposed to it. They're going to riot in the streets if you pass it. Okay? So here, that one vote, one person, one vote idea doesn't match the intensity of those voters' preferences. Another thing, special interest groups. They can create government support for programs with cost outweighing their benefits. Okay. A small group within the society can benefit while the whole society pays the cost. An example of this could be, well, here's one very, very good example, recent times. The LGBT lobby. This is a group of people, maybe 2 to 3% of the population, if that many, who have, because they have concentrated interests, have promoted LGBT policies onto society. And this small group of people, because they have special interest groups, have been able to have a larger role in government policy regarding sexuality and discrimination and things of that nature relative to the straight population, which is widely dispersed. And these guys have been able, the LGBT people, have been able to influence government officials, a very small group, on policies that may or may not benefit the rest of the group, the rest of society. Okay. Rational ignorance. The voters choose to remain uninformed because the marginal cost of obtaining information is higher than the marginal benefit from knowing it. As we said before, why is it that we assume that voters pick the right people or have the right ideas on how the government, the economy or the country should be run? We might go to an engineer or a mechanic and say, hey, I need you to tell me how to fix my car, and you're going to get the right answer. But on the other hand, if we went to him and said, well, should I wear blue or pink? Why do we think he's just as good at picking colors for clothes as we think he is at knowing how a broken car can be fixed? The answer is we shouldn't assume that, right? What if we asked him how to bake a cake? Does he know just as much about baking cakes as he knows about fixing cars? And of course, the answer is probably no. He makes money from fixing cars, so he makes sure that he knows a lot about fixing cars. But on the other hand, he doesn't make money from baking cakes, so why would he have an interest in learning to bake a cake just as well as he learns to fix a car? Finally, bureaucratic inefficiency. We saw this during the Trump administration. The bureaucracy may become more powerful than elected officials. Just because elected officials want something to be done doesn't mean the bureaucrats under them will do it. In fact, a lot of times they won't. And then finally, the short-sighted effect. Democracy has a bias toward programs offering clear benefits with hidden costs. Okay. We'll learn, the next thing we're going to look is the budgetary process. So how are budgets formulated, and how does this budgetary process, how do we finance our national debt? Why or why not worry over the national debt? These are things we're going to look at here. Okay, the major steps of the budgetary process. We have a presidential budget submission that's due in February, budget resolution, which is passed in May, and the budget is passed and the president signs in September, and then the fiscal year starts in October. Remember that. Okay. I can tell you right now, this process has broken down. I think the last budget we had was under the Clinton administration. Okay. I do not believe that Congress has passed a budget and gotten it signed by a president since the Clinton administration. The federal fiscal year starts October 1st and runs through September 30th. Okay, so that's, if you go back, that's why the budget has to be passed by September so that they can implement it in October. When the government does have a budget, they can have a budget surplus. That is the amount by which government tax collections exceed government expenditures. The last time the U.S. government had a federal budget surplus, I believe, was 1955. Okay, or we could have a federal deficit, the amount by which government expenditures exceed tax collection. So here, we spend more than we take in taxes. We haven't balanced the budget since 1955, although the next slide is going to say that it was balanced a bit under the Clinton administration, but that does not take into account off-budget issues. Okay, really, government expenditures exceeded tax collections then. You can see here, if we just use the government's budget statistics, we haven't balanced that budget since 2000, and we have bigger and bigger deficits every year. If we had, after this, we had the Trump administration, the end of the Obama administration, and what we're going to get with the Biden administration, these numbers are in the multiples of trillions, $3 trillion, over $3 trillion budget deficit last year. Okay, here you can see over history. If we go back to 1955, it was balanced. The pink's deficits, the green is a surplus, but they did not take into account off-budget spending, which increased it. Now, we're always concerned about the national debt. The national debt is the amount owed by the federal government to owners of government securities. Okay, when the government wants to spend more than they take in taxes, they have to borrow that money. And the Treasury holds an auction. Banks, foreign central banks, foreign banks, big, large money managers go to the Treasury auctions and they buy the debt directly from the Treasury Department. A lot of that debt then gets sold to our central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. They create money out of thin air to buy that debt. Now, when we talk about this debt, okay, there's the national debt. We don't concern ourselves with who owns those securities. The net public debt is the national debt minus all government interagency borrowing. Some of these government bonds or debt, the government's debt, is owned by another government agency. So we subtract those from the national debt, and that gives us the public debt. Okay, how much does the government owe to the public? And we're not including debt where one agency owes another agency. Okay. How does the U.S. Treasury borrow money? I already explained to that, but they sell securities promising to make interest payments and to repay on a given date and make interest payments until that date. What can be done to curb the national debt? Your tax increases, but there are problems with that. Spending caps and debt ceilings. None of these have worked. Okay, if you increase taxes, what makes you think that they're not going to spend that much more? Spending caps. Well, guess who caps the spending? The spenders, right? That's like if you said, I'm going to stick to my budget this month, and then you spent all your money and you had a couple more days till the end of the month, and you said, well, I'm going to relieve myself of the spending cap and I'm going to use my credit card. That's what the government can do. The very same people who determine spending decide whether or not to keep the cap in place. And then we have the debt ceiling, which is another problem. Okay, the very same people who are supposed to be bound by this debt ceiling can vote to raise it. A debt ceiling is a legislated legal limit on the national debt. Right now, very much right now, we have reached the debt ceiling. The federal government cannot issue additional debt until the debt ceiling is raised. So politicians will grandstand on it and wait till they get what they want and then vote to increase the debt ceiling so that the federal government can borrow more money to pay for their spending. It's kind of ridiculous to think that you would approve spending over the debt ceiling and then somehow not approve raising the debt ceiling. The same people who approve the spending, right, the Congress, also control the debt ceiling. So why would they vote to spend money that causes the debt to go above the debt ceiling and then not vote to raise the debt ceiling to cover that spending they already voted for? Okay, and what happens? Congress raises the ceiling to accommodate the budget deficit, so it's not a very effective measure for reducing the budget. Okay, we're going to skip this stuff. Now here it says, why worry about the national debt? Can Uncle Sam go bankrupt? Your book says no, and I disagree with that. But your book says that that the federal government cannot go bankrupt. One of the reasons is because they control taxing. Well, they agree to spend more than they take in taxes all the time. Wars are a perfect example of that. And governments have gone bankrupt in the past. They go bankrupt in a number of ways. They go bankrupt by what we call suspending specie payment when the dollar or currencies were backed by gold. They say, okay, we've printed up more paper tickets, dollars, than we have gold to back. And now all these paper tickets are coming home to roost. People want their gold because the gold's worth more than the paper tickets. So we just simply won't redeem them anymore. And we'll say that the paper tickets are now money instead of the gold that they represented. And that happened in this country in 1931 through 32. And again, that was domestically and then internationally in the 70s under Nixon. And the U.S. government went bankrupt. Another way they can go bankrupt is by reneging on their commitments. So all of these people who have been promised Social Security, the government could say, we're not going to give it to you, or we're going to reduce your benefits. Okay. Another reason they say that the government can't go bankrupt is because they can print money to pay their bills indirectly. Well, if you print too much money, the value of it decreases to zero and the money becomes worthless. This happened in Zimbabwe, Yugoslavia. They printed so much money to cover government spending that the value of the money fell and eventually became zero, and they don't have currencies anymore. Are Americans passing the debt burden to their children? Okay, these are other concerns. Does government borrowing crowd out private sector spending? These are all issues. Okay, go ahead and answer the questions and we'll get going. What determines interest rates in the money market? We are going to briefly discuss this. Okay, the demand and supply of money in the money market determines the equilibrium of interest rates. So interest rates are determined by the supply and the demand of loanable funds in the market. If you have an excess money supply, more money than people want to hold, they'll buy bonds. Okay, if they buy bonds, bond prices rise and interest rates fall. So if you have more money than we want to hold, that'll cause bond prices to fall. Okay, why do bond interest rates to fall? Why do bond prices rise as interest rates fall? Above the equilibrium interest rate, people hold more money than they wish and they use their excess money to buy bonds. This increase in demand for bonds drives bond prices up, which lowers the interest rate on the bonds. If you have excess money demand, people have they want more money than they have. They'll sell the bonds to get the cash. If they do that, bond prices will fall and interest rates rise. Okay, that's what I just explained. So here we have the demand for money and the supply of money. Okay, at an interest rate of 4%. All of a sudden, interest rates, if they went up to 6%, here people would have more money than they want. They want this amount of money, but there's this much in existence. So that would cause them to take this excess money, buy bonds. As they buy bonds, the price of the bonds goes up and the interest rates go down, bringing us back towards equilibrium, and the opposite case here. Okay, how can the Fed influence the equilibrium interest rate? Okay, here we're talking about monetary policy. It can increase or decrease the supply of money. If it increases the supply of money, that causes a money surplus. People have more money than they want, and they will buy bonds. When they buy bonds, that will cause the price of the bonds to go up and the interest rate on those bonds to go down. Okay, so here we're going to increase the money supply. By doing so, we have more money than people really want to hold at 6%. So people will take that they will take that money and buy bonds with it, driving interest rates down. So if the Fed increases the money supply, that will cause a decrease in interest rates. Okay, here we're talking about monetary policy, chapter 27. Okay. If you get a decrease in the money supply, the opposite occurs. You cause a money shortage. People will sell bonds to get more cash or more money. When they sell the bonds, that will lower the price of the bonds and increase interest rates on the market. So here's a money supply decrease from MS1 to MS2. Here, at this new money supply, right, we have less money than we really want to hold at 4%. So we will sell bonds for cash. As we sell bonds for cash, interest rates go up, demand for money decreases, quantity demanded of money decreases, and we get to a new equilibrium here at a higher interest rate. So if the Federal Reserve, that's who controls monetary money supply in the U.S., if they want to increase interest rates, they will decrease the money supply. If they want to decrease interest rates, which they normally do, they will increase the money supply. Okay? When you have changes in the money supply in a Keynesian model, that affects investment spending. At lower rates of interest, businessmen will borrow more money to invest in new business projects. And that will increase investment spending, causing aggregate demand to increase, which will increase real GDP, increase employment and prices in the Keynesian model. Okay, by increasing I. Okay, so here's the Keynesian monetary policy transmission effect, a little picture. Change in the money supply affects a change in interest rates. The change in interest rates affects investment spending, I, which causes an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand, a change in aggregate demand, which causes a change in prices, real GDP, and employment levels. Okay, so it's kind of a roundabout process in the Keynesian model. Okay. Okay, here we increase the money supply. That causes a surplus of money. People will use that money to buy bonds using cash that they don't want to hold. As they do that, interest rates decrease. Okay, bringing us to a new equilibrium over here at E2. More money is now in the bond market. Okay, available for businesses to borrow. That will cause them at lower interest rates to borrow this money, spending more money in the economy on investment projects. Okay, when they make an investment, for business investment projects for which the expected rate of profit equals or exceeds the interest rate. Okay, so if they increase the amount they spend on investment, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So I goes up. That causes an increase in aggregate demand. Output increases, price levels increase, and unemployment goes down. Okay? Price levels go up. Monetarism, on the other hand, which is really right-wing Keynesianism or monetary Keynesianism, there's not much difference, is the theory that changes in the money supply directly determine changes in prices, real GDP, and employment. So here, they believe that money transmission mechanism is sort of a shorter process. You change the money supply, Okay, change in monetary policy causes a change in the money supply. That causes, I'm sorry, this is chapter 26. I told you it was 27. A change in the aggregate demand curve, which causes changes in prices, real GDP, and unemployment. Okay. And they believe that it is a shorter process because of something called the equation of exchange. This is an accounting identity that states the money supply times the velocity of money equals total spending. PQ here is total spending in the economy. So, like the Keynesians, they think that more spending generates more real output. They believe that the velocity of money, which is you can think of it as the average number of times a dollar is spent. The original monetarists believed that this was constant, okay, that it didn't change. So if you increase the supply of money, that money gets spent, say, 7 times, each dollar gets 7 times a year. That's going to equal the amount of spending in the economy. So if you increase the money supply, that increases spending, PQ here, and that increases aggregate demand directly, causing prices and or quantity of output to go up. Okay, we talked about the velocity of money, the quantity theory of money, the theory that changes in the money supply are directly related to changes in the price level. Okay, the conclusion is that any change in the money supply must lead to a proportional change in the price level, because classical economists argue that the velocity of money v and the real output remains constant. Okay, the modern monetarist view of the classical quantity theory of money is that although velocity is not unchanging, it is predictable, and that the Fed should increase the money supply at a constant percentage to avoid inflation or recession. Some monetarists actually advocate a small amount of price inflation, okay, like around 2%. Our current Federal Reserve had been trying to maintain price inflation at 2%, saying that what causes recessions are actually decreases in price levels. So if price levels go down, that will cause a recession. So we can keep them from going down by maintaining the money supply at a rate that avoids price inflation, or in this case, price deflation, which causes a recession, decreasing price levels. Okay, Milton Friedman was a major proponent of this. Many people call him a free marketeer, but he was a socialist in terms of money supply. He advocated government control over the money supply. He's also a founder of the current income tax policy, where you pay your taxes before they're due, right? Withholding taxes. Okay, all right. We're going to skip that. Here, the velocity of money. The Keynesians say that the velocity of money is not stable or predictable, so that relationship does not hold. If you look historically, there's evidence on both sides. During the early 1980s and 1990s, and after 2001, velocity was unpredictable, supporting the Keynesian view. Between 1946 and 1981, and 1993 and 2000, velocity rose at a predictable or constant rate, supporting the monetarist. Okay, so let's compare these views. The classical view, if we sum everything up, argues that the economy automatically self-corrects to full employment in the long run because of flexible prices and wages. Therefore, there is no need for fiscal policy. We do not need the government engaging in the use of tax and spending policies to affect macroeconomic change. The classical economists believe that quantity theory of money and that increases in the money supply cause price inflation.